Yeah, I'm always struck by the appropriate word for the Samaritan's actions in that story to be extravagant. A denarius was basically what you could, if you were just like a entry-level laborer, not particularly skilled, what you would assume to be making each day, so a day's wages. And that's kind of where the phrase, our daily bread, comes from in the Lord's Prayer. A denarius would purchase your daily bread. So 2 denarii worth of compensation to the innkeeper. It's just kind of like, imagine you're going through a crisis and you need like just 2 days' wages to get you by, you know? There's something about that image of somebody being that willing to share that strikes me each and every time. So one of my primary responsibilities at my previous church was actually to manage our pastor's discretionary fund and respond to requests. The thing about it is and the reason I kind of laugh is, for many pastors, that's kind of like I don't know what to call it. When you think about all the things a pastor does, or the things that you would do in a day, at work, it's kind of like at the bottom, not because it's not important, it's more because like there's just so little money with it, right? It depends on the church. Now, it didn't start out that way for me. That was not one of my biggest responsibilities at Bethany. And I certainly did not intend for it to become what it did. It grew from maybe pulling in around $300 or so a month total in like the plates for monthly communion. We do that here too. And 300 isn't a lot, especially when you consider that at that church, as big as it was, 3 services of communion, right? $300. To within a year's time, just a little over $2,000 a month. And then eventually, by the end of that first year that I took the management over of it, banking roughly just a little under $22,000 as the congregation's generosity began to overcome the number of requests that I was fielding. And I'm so grateful to have had the experiences I did managing it. My work brought me in close proximity with the working poor of Howard County. And it helped me to understand that it's foolish to assume that everyone who needs financial help fits some kind of one-size-fits-all definition of being poor. When you think of somebody being poor, for some reason, we always seem to go to the homeless. This image of a dirty, smelly, old man walking the streets, bowed over, barely scraping by, right? But no, there's all kinds of poor people in this country. The people that I worked with were, by and large, people who weren't more than maybe 1 or 2 paychecks behind on meeting their expenses. That's it. 1 or 2 paychecks behind. Unless they told you that they were in dire straits, you would never have known that they were in financial trouble just by looking at them. They would have looked like they had everything together. Now, one difficulty I experienced was that as the fund continued to grow, and the way I kind of did it was I told stories about the people that I helped, never using names. It was always supposed to be anonymous. But people heard the stories and they were moved. They started giving not just on Communion Sundays. They were even thinking about like their end-of-year giving. Like, you know, Pastor Lim, I think that our family really wants to contribute to the fund this year as part of our charity giving. What do you need? And people would start to contribute in that way, large amounts of money, because they felt like they were helping people, you know, like they were directly touching their lives. But as that happened, as that money came in, it's like God heard that and said, okay, you've taken care of this little bit, now you're ready to take on a lot more. And so those requests grew. Eventually, I was mired in them. I was easily committing 20 hours a week to this cause on top of my normal pastoral duties. I didn't intend for that to happen. It just did. And yes, it was very tiring. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of work. But I was happy to do it, because I knew I was helping people. I'll be real honest with you. I really enjoyed taking money from people who were well off and giving it to people who weren't so well off, And there wasn't a single person who presented me with a worthy request that I didn't feel good getting to know and helping. Every single person who I got to speak with, I remember them all. And I was blessed by just having a conversation with them, actually getting to know the people that I was helping. Until one hot Friday afternoon. The reason I'm preaching this sermon is because this last week was what I consider to be the 1-year anniversary of this particular request. I think it's very funny that the scripture passage in the Revised Common Lectionary, which I use as a pastor, was the one for this Sunday. So, with a number of requests, a lot of them, occupying space on my very large desk, one particular request came in that seemed pretty typical. So a woman came into the office. She might have been in her late 30s. She was desperate for help. And she claimed that she had been living with her father, but after a falling out, had been put out on the street and was currently living out of her car, which was the majority of folks that came in. They were either couch surfing or they were living out of their car. As she told me more of her story, it became clear that something was kind of wrong. It sounded off. I was worried I was getting scammed. Her specific request wasn't something I could really take care of at that moment because I didn't have immediate access to funds. I couldn't just give cash or whatever. That's not the way that we did it. And it didn't feel right, But I told her, okay, I'll check into it. I'll get back to you. No problem. Now, every request that I received, because I use that word worthy request, every single request that I received was vetted for accuracy. I actually developed a process for this. Unfortunately, not every request is one with honest intentions. That's just how it is sometimes. Fraud is a real concern with this kind of ministry. You do a Google search about this sort of thing, there's all kinds of horror stories. I talked regularly with other area pastors who would offer this kind of help, and many had seen, even in their own congregations, how just one bad request, one instance of fraud, can poison an entire congregation against working with the poor. It's sad. One of the tools I use to this day to vet any requests that I get are online searches through Google and Facebook to kind of just try to understand a little bit more about a person's life, what's going on there. Now, when I looked up this young woman, I came across something that really kind of took me back. It was hard for me. So I found her profile on Facebook, and I discovered really quickly that she was a supporter of our sitting president. There was a lot of very racist propaganda on her profile. I didn't care so much that she was a Trump supporter. Okay, fine. It was the racist propaganda that really got to me, because one particular photo that I observed was, to say the least, very disparaging of Mexicans, right? I'm a Mexican. And I'll be honest, it really did anger me. I was upset. But Trump supporter or no, racist or no, this woman needed help. And God put me in her life. Or rather, maybe God put her in mine. And I was walking the road, and there she was, lying in a ditch of her own, just like in the story. And I had a choice I had to make, right? I had just faced my Good Samaritan moment. So this event led me to realize that every single Christian has several Good Samaritan moments in their lifetime. Moments where they're asked to help somebody, several people maybe, that might not fit their idea of people being deserving of help. And they, like I did, have a choice to make in those moments, each and every one of us. Now, one of my favorite theologians is a man named Frederick Buechner. This man has a way of reading Scripture and talking about it that's really, really insightful. He breaks it down in a very easy way to understand. He once wrote the following excerpt about the interaction between Jesus and this religious scholar that confronted him about who exactly Jesus was talking about when he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." So this is what he says. When Jesus said to love your neighbor, this lawyer who was present asked him to clarify what he meant by neighbor. This lawyer wanted a legal definition he could refer to in case the question of loving a neighbor ever happened to come up in common conversation. He presumably wanted something very defined in the order of a neighbor, hereinafter referred to as the party of the first part, is to be construed as meaning a person of Jewish descent whose legal residence is within a radius of no more than 3 statute miles from one's own legal residence, unless there is another person of Jewish descent, hereinafter to be referred to as the party of the second part, living closer to the party of the first part than one is oneself, in which case the party of the second part is to be construed as neighbor to the party of the first part, and one is oneself relieved of all responsibility of any sort or kind whatsoever. Right? Instead, Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, the point of which seems to be that your neighbor is to be construed as meaning anybody that needs you. The lawyer's response is left unrecorded. So, when it comes to helping others, many Christians seem to resonate more with this religious scholar than with Jesus, and here's what I mean by that. So, as an example, in most Christian denominations, a majority or a near majority believe that our country has no responsibility to accept refugees. I didn't know that until recently. Refugees are one of the most disadvantaged groups of people you can think of. They literally have no rights, right? They are not part of any country anymore, except for the country that they immigrate to. I learned this troubling statistic, troubling at least to me, through the Pew Research Center for Religion, one of the most acclaimed kind of data gathering agencies in our country. A majority or a near majority of Christians in our country believe that our country has absolutely no responsibility to accept refugees. If Egypt had felt the same when Jesus was an infant and fled his home country, I don't know that we'd be here today. I don't know that I would be preaching to you about the God and the man that came to save my life and yours. I don't know what I'd be doing with my life right now, because that poor baby wouldn't even be alive. If this statistic is not troubling to you, I really want to invite you to read the story of the Good Samaritan again and again and again until it hits you. Now, when developing the policies that helped me and my senior pastor to administer our fund, I came a lot of best practice documents from other churches, and a particular practice kept coming up. That when offering aid from the pastor's discretionary fund, priority should be given to members of the church before everyone else. In one respect, yeah, I mean, it does seem like a pretty good practice, right? I mean, after all, the easiest people to trust are the people you claim to be a part of, right? It's safe to assume that you're less likely as a church to be taken advantage of if you only deal with people inside of the walls, people you've gotten to know over the years. But what if the motivation behind this practice is far more sinister? What if it arises not out of a concern about being taken advantage of, but because communities of faith throughout this country care more about the people inside of the walls than the ones on the outside? When Jesus confronted the scholar with the story of the Good Samaritan, he was making a point. He was saying, your religious convictions are a shoddy cover for a prejudiced heart. Many excellent and well-reasoned arguments could be made for why the actions of the priest and in Jesus' story were justified, why this holy man was justified in his belief. Both of these people, it was actually two of them, priest and Levite, they were holy men who ascribed by faith and by profession to ritual laws of purity that prevented them from touching corpses. The description that Jesus gave of that poor bandit, of the bandit's victim, described him as being half dead. Half dead. It's entirely possible that both of these holy men only saw a corpse, nothing more. They were not allowed to touch the corpse. But even if that was true, why didn't they enlist the help of others to get word back to the nearest village about what happened? Why just continue along their way as if nothing had happened? In our rush to cast judgment on other people, we often end up convicting ourselves. My mom always liked to use that on me, by the way. You know, whenever you point the finger, there's 3 more that are pointing back at you, Lem. I believe this was another important lesson that Jesus was trying to teach the one who was questioning him. The Samaritan belonged to a group that was hated by the Jews. There were many historical reasons for this racist behavior. It's a long, long story, but it basically breaks down to differences in culture, religion, ethnicity, reasons for exclusion that persist even to this day, things that we are very familiar with. As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I say exclusion because when you boil down this parable, the motivations behind the scholar's question, who is my neighbor, they're very simple. He believed that a neighbor is somebody that you define, right? If you have trouble with a neighbor living on the right side of your home, but have a glowing relationship with the neighbor on your left, which are you most likely going to consider to be an actual neighbor, right? The one you have a good relationship with. What Jesus is trying to make clear is that our neighbors are not the people that we define. They are the people that God has defined. They may come in forms that surprise or even enrage, but there they are. They're not going anywhere. And God expects us to respond to them when they are in need. We are called to love people into life. All people. Being committed to the love of neighbor requires us to be able to see an enemy, a bitter foe, as somebody that can bless us. One who can teach us about true compassion and righteousness. This requires a level of humility that allows us to kind of push past our prejudices and to see people as they are. People created in the image of God. If Jesus was teaching this parable to someone today, if he was teaching it to you, he just as well have used somebody we would never dream of being capable of teaching us anything. Who would that be for you? For me, it was somebody with politics 180 degrees from my own. But I'm a pastor, and God does not have politics. So in the end, who do I listen to? Me? My brain? Or God? If it's me, I'll tell you what, I better hang up this robe and this stole right now. Better start getting more sleep on Sunday mornings. That actually would never happen. Abe doesn't let us get any sleep on Sunday mornings. We never get to sleep in with that boy. He's got to have his pancakes. He's got to have his sausage. So doesn't it seem like every day we live in this country, we get another opportunity to hear about just how different we are from each other? How divided we are. You hear politicians talk about reaching across the aisle, but it never goes beyond talk. We are actively working against each other for the other's downfall. We are literally doing that in politics. When we're out in the street, we are actively working for the downfall of those across the aisle from us. And that extends to you and me, even in the church. It is practically in our nature to love only the people most like us, most familiar to us, most pleasing to us. We judge the unfamiliar, the weird, the offensive, and so we build a wall between us and them. When we do this, we make them lower than those whom we love and care about, lower on the totem pole, lower in priority. Can't you see how wrong that is? God calls upon us to love them as we love ourselves and those we care about, because God sees them the same way that God sees you. God loved them enough to send his Son to die for them and you, even me. This parable is Jesus proclaiming death to a world ordered by our increasingly narrow definition of just who our neighbor is and should be. And that is who Jesus is, the Alpha and the Omega, right? The beginning and the end. It all boils down to love, really. I mean, denying someone love is a terrible thing. If my wife, for example, came up to me for a kiss and I told her, you know what? Leave me alone, Bonnie. That does something to our relationship, right? I do it enough, I guarantee you I'm going to end up a cold and lonely man. Might still look good on Sunday mornings, though, right? Like that matters. Of course it's hard for me to think of myself ever doing that to her, but everything in this world has a beginning. Becoming cold and callous people requires practice, friends. And if you're the kind that finds it easy to deny Christ's love to strangers, what do you think will eventually happen to your ability to express love to those closest to you? It's gonna happen. Particularly when you start to focus on the things that make you different from them. Husbands, pay attention. Wives, pay attention. We are all different, but that doesn't mean that we cannot love one another, right? That's why we took the vows we did. And if that scares someone today, this idea of losing our ability to love, well, then I did my job this morning. I really did. Scares me. And this is really hard stuff to contemplate, you know? The more that we do it, though, the more that we realize how we all fall very short of God's glory. We do. But thank God for grace. It's a wonderful thing. For God's forgiveness. Because without it, we would all be lost. God is a God of infinite chances. Every breath you take is an opportunity to try again. And God is constantly challenging us, poking us, prodding us, not to punish us, but because God knows that we are up to the challenge. God will stop at nothing. God will use anyone or anything to help us learn what true love really is and to feel that on the inside. And my prayer for you all is that when your next Good Samaritan moment comes, you won't allow yourself to just pass on the other side. You'll swallow your pride, the things that divide. You'll swallow it and you'll demonstrate the love that you have learned from the one that so loved the world that, what? Gave his only begotten Son? That whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have life eternal. Amen.